Miss Katarina Klingová holds a Master's of Arts in European Studies at University of Bratislava in 2011 and a Master's of Arts in Political Science at Central European University in Budapest. Ms. Klingová started working as a project assistant in the Slovak Atlantic Commission, and then as an assistant researcher at the Central European Policy Institute, to finally, in 2014, become a project coordinator, researcher and office manager. After 1 year traineeship at the Directorate General for Regional and Urban Policy of the European Commission, she is currently employed as a Senior Research Fellow Democracy and Resilience Program at the GlobeSec Policy Institute. And that's where we met, meaning in Slovakia. And again, Katarina, I'm absolutely happy to have you with us, because I've been taking a deeper look into the research material you have been introducing to us when we were in Slovakia. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation, summing today's presentations up.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind words. Thank you very much for the invitation and possibility, to speak to you today. If we can pull up my presentation, I'll try to not repeat what was said by my fellow colleagues. So some parts I'm going to just skip through, or skim very lightly over. I have quite a few things that are really showing what is the state of play in Central Europe, predominantly focusing in Slovakia. I'm going to pull some also examples from different regions, but I wanted to, give you practical experiences of what we've observed, what we are seeing in my country, in the region, and, show you the actors, show you the tools, and then talk a bit about the impact on the public perceptions. Next slide, please. Well, actually, we can go to the next slide, please. So when it comes to disinformation scene and disinformation actors, as you heard from, Jakub, Doan, or Lieutenant Colonel Kaspar, there's plethora actors. In Slovakia, particularly, there's over 1,800 disinformation actors on Facebook. There are 253 websites that are both in Czech and also Slovak language, spreading disinformation in my country. The closeness of the languages makes Slovak society much more vulnerable to disinformation coming from Czech Republic. But what we've been observing throughout the years of our monitoring information operations in the region, back in 2015, back in 2014, it was really coming from the outside, it was really coming from the Kremlin. But throughout the past, 2-3 years, we see that it's more and more domestic actors that are the main venues and the main actors that eventually spread disinformation. And these include political leaders, often, at the highest levels. And this is very, very problematic. Throughout the years, we've seen many direct or indirect links. For example, one of the pseudo-journalists or contributors to one of the main disinformation outlets in Slovakia. He's actually Russian citizens living in Slovakia for many years, but he's been writing under a Slovak name, an acronym, in order not to appear to be Russian. He often, takes various representatives, and this is a common practice that a lot of representatives, whether from the Russian embassy or various Russian or Kremlin connected media outlets, they try to establish contacts to various journalists, bloggers, active, members of society, and take them to the Kremlin and do the tour de table, meet everybody, and establish the connections in the Kremlin with important actors. Throughout the years, especially now with the escalation of the war, we see that Telegram is becoming a very important venue of communication in Central Europe. But as Jakub said, the situation, the information environment, the messages, what kind of messages are being communicated to various target audiences very much depend from the vulnerabilities of each society, and that's very much differ. I'll comment a bit on the picture. On the picture, you see the military attaché, the former military attaché of the Russian embassy, Sergei Solomesov, and Bohuž Garbar. He's a pseudo-journalist to this main disinformation outlet in Slovakia. And this video, there is a picture from a video where the military attaché is giving basically money to this pseudo journalist for his good job, and then he's giving him more money in order to recruit other, friends in order to work for them or provide them with information. Next slide, please. As I said, the problem is that we have increasing number of political representatives and political parties that are really reorienting themselves in order to be spreading disinformation, populist narratives, or polarizing narratives that are eventually undermining our unity, undermining our democratic processes. And we see it via systematic use of political sponsored contents, paid commentators that are being used on a regular basis. We see that the disinformation outlets are really being spread by various public sources channels if the actors are in the government. Next slide, please. Another thing that we saw when it comes to political leaders, I'm just going to add one more remark to the previous slide, was that when we look at the narratives of political leadership throughout the years in Central and Eastern Europe, one of the things that was noted that the political parties, political leaders, once in power, they're quite Euro-Atlantic oriented, but as soon as they lose and leave the parliament or become part of the oppositions, they become increasingly anti, let's say, Euro-Atlantic. They're much more critical towards the European Union. They're much more critical towards the NATO, and often become the voices of various pro-Kremlin or pro-Chinese narratives. This picture and this slide eventually elaborates and shows how detailed and how well connected is the network of pro-Kremlin or disinformation actors in Slovakia. This was done by Gerolata Technologies, and they basically mapped the amount of disinformation that were being spread in January, in the beginning of this year, in Slovakia in connection to the Defense Cooperation Agreement, which was being finalized and signed at the end of January in Slovakia. Basically, the only thing that is like mainstream media is green. Blue dots are public institutions. Ivan Korčok, he's our, at that time, Minister of Foreign Affairs. The big white, bubbles, dots are disinformation outlets, and anything on the left are, this malign, often anti-system political actors that spread disinformation. And you see huge interconnectedness, you see huge resharing of the content, very systematic reshare of content. And Gerolata basically looked at the time frame of 1.5 months. And when you count that the main disinformation outlet in Slovakia, Hlavné správy, posted within that 1.5 months time period 195 articles or posts on the DCA in a negative way, then you really understand that that the spread of disinformation is very systematic, it's very coordinated, and it's very well prepared. Next slide, please. Another thing that we've observed, not only in Slovakia, though I'm going to use the example of Slovakia, is that you cannot build resilience, which was mentioned by Kaspar, when your leadership doesn't have appropriate knowledge, when your leadership, political leadership, is actually vulnerable to various influence operations, when they do not have situational awareness or do not understand that they themselves can be the tools of the propaganda or the tools of the foreign influence. And despite the fact that I do not like to use this term, I'm going to use it, become the useful idiots of various malign foreign actors. So in March 2021, our government eventually decided not to get the Sputnik V vaccine, despite the fact one Sunday, there was information that there is a direct flight coming from Moscow to Slovakia, and then 100,000 batches of Sputnik V vaccines are on the board. Our, at the time, Prime Minister, who's on that nice infographic of RT on the left, basically he said that he's not a killer, and Sputnik V is going to stay in Slovakia, it's not going to return to Russia. There's a whole, there was a governmental crisis that lasted over 1 month. There was a quarrel, well, it was not a quarrel, but he completely undermined the expertise of the medical authorities responsible for authorization of the medicine in Slovakia, and that was utilized immediately. I mean, that kind of rhetoric, those kind of declarations, I'm not the killer, we're going to use Sputnik V vaccine, were immediately utilized by the Kremlin machinery in order to promote the success of the Sputnik V vaccine, or in order to accuse our authorities of the act of sabotage and trying to wage disinformation against the Sputnik V. So we need to educate our own leaders in order for them not to be vulnerable towards these kind of things. Next slide, please. This map is a visualization of Hungarian Facebook that we've done in beginning of 2020, and this goes back to Duwan, what Duwan said eventually, that we need to really map out the ways that the information flows in respective societies. And when we mapped out Facebook in Hungary, we really saw that the information space in Hungary is very much clustered, that you have communities that are very enclosed, and there's very few breaches. But at the same time, we really saw that at the center of the map is Viktor Orban and public institutions that eventually served as a venue and tools as the venues that were streamlining pro-Kremlin but also pro-Chinese propaganda directly to the Hungarian information space. And that is problematic, because no matter how capable fact checkers are or civil societies engaged in fact checking are, they cannot compete with such a state sponsored or state streamlined machinery. Next slide, please. Another thing that we've observed, and that was observable during the COVID-19 pandemic, is that we've been talking about the Russian disinformation, and I'm talking predominantly about the Russian pro-Kremlin disinformation in the region. But with COVID-19, we really saw that a lot of disinformation, a lot of conspiracy theories about COVID-19 were actually coming from the West. This is the picture of the video that was shared by Chemtrail Slovakia. Originated, it was a video of InfoWars produced by Alex Jones, InfoWars, banned in the United States, but then a few months later became viral in the region because the social media platforms, they were not able to take it down. And as you can see, it even has little notification that this video was banned, and the message is like, please share, because it's share it as much as possible before they take it down. So this is one of the problems, that our own polarization within our own Western democratic societies, our own quarrels, are actually being utilized and spread within our information environment to further undermine our democratic processes. Next slide, please. We've spoken, but also Jakub mentioned, various actors of influence in Slovakia. This was also Night Wolves Europe, the European branch of Night Wolves, the Russian Night Wolves, which was established in 2019. You see Vladimir Putin shaking hands with the president, Yaroslav Hamba, the president of Slovak Night Wolves, the spread of historical narratives, commemoration at various anniversaries of First World War, Second World War are perfect opportunities for various pro-Russian actors to spread the propaganda among ordinary people. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, yes. On this picture, you see active collaboration of Petr Švrček. He's the commander of Slovak Conscript. Slovak Conscript is a paramilitary unit. They actually dissolved themselves this year because they wanted and decided to become politically active. But the Slovak Conscript is a paramilitary organization whose leader, including Petr Švrček, went to Russia and got a training from GRU officers. And they saw nothing problematic about it, then came back to Slovakia and eventually started to train their own, fellow members, etc. So Slovak conscripts were, as it's seen on this picture, shaking hands with the Night Wolves Europe, signing memorandum of cooperation, closely cooperating, exchanging the support, etc. Next slide, please. And that kind of support eventually led into Slovak conscripts training at Night Wolves compound in Slovakia on old military equipment, which was supposed to be sitting at the military museum, which was supposed to be the compound of Night Wolves. And this caused a huge uproar in Slovakia because that compound of Night Wolves and that military equipment that was being used by, paramilitary organization trained by GRU was only, several tens of kilometers away from our nuclear power plant. So yeah, a bit of a security threat there. Next slide, please. Another thing that we've observed is that the influence operations, or one of the audience vulnerable to influence operations, but also target audience of various influence operations, are members of intelligence and security institutions. In the past years, especially in Slovakia, we've seen that far-right extremist parties and far-right representatives are recruiting their new members from intelligence institutions, among others, for example, the former head of military counterintelligence. So like a person who was supposed to be looking into Kremlin's propaganda and Kremlin's foreign malign influence, stopping them, eventually joined the party that, with the escalation of war, was praising the denazification of Slovakia and its members in the European Parliament, its representatives in the European Parliament were blocking EU votes and actions to be taken against Russia. We see, I mean, the data is not official. I'm definitely not going to be talking about how much vulnerable are the members of security institutions, but we know that they are very much vulnerable to various disinformation narratives, conspiracy theories, and are very vulnerable to Kremlin propaganda, and also are, the target audience of various spies. The picture I included here is a picture of the head of the Association of Slovak Soldiers, who already in 2017, I mean, it was an unofficial organization, basically an NGO. So this former soldier and, the head of Association of Slovak Soldiers, he accused at that time our Minister of Foreign Affairs and our Minister of Defense of treason, because they were supporting, Slovak active participation in EU and NATO institutions. Next slide, please. We've talked about this. One thing that I will mention is that we are losing the battle of narratives in the global south, where RT, Sputnik are, having a heyday in spreading their Russian Kremlin-originated narratives. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. When we spoke about the tools, I would just add that we've seen also in the past months attempt to pay various influencers in order to be the voices of the reason or the people that are going to spread particular narratives. Deepfake videos are definitely going to be a problem because they get super sophisticated, and people who do not have digital skills will not really be able to say whether something is real or whether it's something AI originated. And yeah, more and more when it comes to authoritarian actors, we see measures of control being taken as internet shutdowns, surveillance, and online censorship. Next slide, please. And this is the video that, yeah, okay, so we're playing the video. This is the video that we've seen already in 2014. It's an example of how sophisticated messages are.
During the 3 months of armed clashes in the Donbas region, the Kiev authorities have not been able to quell the uprising of the People's Militia. Inept command, thousands of dead soldiers, and a critical shortage of funding does not give the Kiev regime any hope of winning. Kiev's appeals to NATO for military assistance were ignored. So far, the conflict in the east of Ukraine looks local, and the attempt to provoke Russia into a war with Ukraine did not work. The next attempt from Kiev was the shooting down by the Ukrainian military of a civilian aircraft. The responsibility for this terrible tragedy, even without having started an investigation, was put upon Russia, which supports the People's Militia. Such a crime was necessary for the Kiev regime to make this conflict international and to show the whole world that the People's Militia are the international terrorists. The exposure of this fabrication by the SBU fake militias negotiation, as well as the hard facts provided by the Russian General Staff, proved the involvement of the Ukrainian army in the plane crash. This provocative murder was carried out under the orders of Kiev and the American Special Services in order to draw NATO into a war with Russia. Why do Americans need this war? For improving their economic position, just as they did in the First and the Second World Wars. The accusation of Russian aggression allows countries to impose sanctions on it, freeze assets of the Russian structures, causing the write-off of hundreds of billions of dollars, and ease the heavy debt burden of the United States. Broken economic relations with Russia are going to aggravate the condition of the European economy and weaken its position in competition with America. The destabilization of the banking system will encourage the capital outflows into the United States to maintain the dollar pyramid. The retraction of the European countries into a war with Russia is going to strengthen their political dependence on America, which will lead to decisions favorable to the United States rather than the EU. Thanks to this war, the American military-industrial complex will get many orders. The US economy will flourish. Meanwhile, weakened by the war, Russia will be easier to control, as it used to be in the dashing 90s. Thus, after destroying the main competitors on the world's arena, America will get a strategic advantage in the fight for global leadership with China. In contrast to the EU and Russia's collapsed economy and piles of corpses, Americans will stay as winners. The war on foreign grounds is what has saved the economy of the United States more than once. It's safe to say that Ukraine will not stop the genocide of the Russian population, and their provocations will become even more horrifying. Sooner or later, Russian troops will enter the territory of Ukraine. But to avoid millions of Russian, Ukrainian and European victims, the EU leaders must turn away from their overseas owners and admit that Russia does not only protect its national interests, but seeks to prevent the outbreak of World War III. Otherwise, the survivors of World War III are going to witness the new American economic miracle.
I found this video in autumn 2014 that it was titled on YouTube, why does the US need a war in Europe? And there was this English, Spanish, but also German version. A few months later, it was taken down. So, you know, some of the narratives are completely similar that we see now. It's very sophisticated. It's not something that is being done by amateurs. in their basements or something. There was a question on, well, what is the impact, or what is the difference between the mainstream media and disinformation media? In the past years, we've seen mainstreamization of disinformation in mainstream media, meaning that more and more political actors, more and more, when being invited to mainstream media, they themselves spread disinformation. So broader audience via mainstream channels is exposed to various disinformation outlets. We found out that the presence of disinformation correlates with the presence of influence of pro-Kremlin actors. There's a rising state control of public broadcasters, which is very, very problematic. There's a rising lack of access to diverse political perspectives in various countries, especially in Hungary. With the invasion, we really saw that some of the supposed experts were next day eventually protesting or leading the protests against the war, against the government. And increasingly we see various foreign malign actors buying up various alternative regional papers and trying to establish, like networks of small regional papers. For example, China does this in Western Balkan. Next slide, please. This shows the impact of monetization of disinformation. There's a great study of NATO Stratcom CCOE on the black market for social media manipulation. The study really shows out how easy and accessible it is to buy the impact on various social media channels. Please have a look at that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm just going to show you the impact in order to find out how widespread are various disinformation narratives. In the region, we started to do our public opinion polls titled GlobSec Trends. The first one was done in 2016. So we've been doing this on an annual basis for quite a while. The latest one covers 9 countries, and we collected the data at the late March, beginning of April. And was focusing on the war, and we basically were able to grasp the first, let's say, perceptions of the war. It's a representative sample per country. Next slide, please. And what we saw was that, yes, the perception of strategic partnerships among Central Eastern European definitely changed, but it didn't really change that much. Germany, with its undecisiveness, lost a bit of lost of its a bit of a glamour and perception that it's a regional level, and United States, because of the security situation, really popped out. Next slide, please. But when we look at the data on by country, we really see that for many people, the war was not a wake-up call, but in various societies, as in Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, but also in Latvia, due to the Russian-speaking minority, there are huge parts of society that still perceive Russia as the most important strategic partner, and those people are, under the influence of various information operations that have been, which they have been exposed to for years, and those kind of perceptions will not change from one day to another just because the war erupts. Next slide, please. Similar thing we saw when it comes to the perception of threats. Russia definitely jumped up on an average numbers, but once again, next slide, when we break down those perceptions per country, we see, that majority of Bulgarians in the beginning of April, or majority of Hungarians in the beginning of April, when the war was already happening, do not or did not perceive Russia as a security threat. Next slide, please. And yes, this graph, this chart shows that depending from the country, from 30 to 40% of respondents, so quite significant part of the population, believe and continue to believe various disinformation narratives that were already mentioned by my fellow speakers. Next slide, please. I believe this is it. Yeah, yes, conspiracy theories. People believe various conspiracy theories. We see, the difference in the vulnerabilities. But that is a huge problem that is eventually undermining the democratic processes, but also is polarizing the societies. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you very much for your attention, and this is all for me. Sorry for being so long.